All right. Just a quick introduction, Steve, since I don't think we've met yet, and we do record and share these. My name is Aaron Crosman. I'm a senior specialist at Attain Partners, and in their Salesforce services group. So actually much of my day job these days is Salesforce related, although I have a long Drupal background and do build out when we have clients with Drupal portals, I'm on those projects, but I also do a variety of other things. One of which of late has been a lot of data migrations. So being part of teams that are moving data into, in my case, mostly Salesforce, but sometimes also we're prepping Drupal sites and other additional systems. And so I've been thinking about data migration in a rather platform agnostic way, because I am kind of forced to move between a variety of platforms as part of that. And I've been wanting to kind of think through ways to challenge myself and my colleagues about kind of, are the migrations well structured and rigorous? And the other piece of this title is I'm a Quaker. And in the Quaker tradition, one of the things that we do is there is a tradition of asking questions, that are queries that are intentionally kind of slanted and pointed in a direction to challenge ourselves to think through a topic of practical nature or of ethics, and give ourselves those kind of places to think it through and work on it, and recognizing that none of us are perfect and that there's room for growth and improvement. And so I liked that frame for doing this, and it also makes a nice title when you're working on data queries. So that's where this came from. So what I'm going to do here is I'll go through the queries I've written, read them, and then talk about why I think it's important. And then I'll leave plenty of time for questions, discussions, and additional challenges at the end. Are your tools good enough? Our migrations live and die by our tools. Are your tools built for the scale of project? Do they empower you to do your best work or impede rapid progress? Would a new tool serve you better now or in the future? One of the things about any team is we tend to get used to the tools we use, whether that tool is a specific ETL, whether it is our IDE, whether it is Drupal migrate, or the feeds module. And we don't always stop at each project and say, is this really the right tool for this job? Am I using a tool that's at the right scale? Am I using a tool that's massively overkill? Or am I right at the tool's limits? And the next time we get a one notch bigger client, I'm kind of up a creek because it's not going to be up to the task. And should I start learning that next tier tool either now or as a follow-up to this project so that I'm ready for the next scale up? And thinking about whether you're using the right job for the tool and using it well. I had years ago inherited a site where somebody had used the migrate module in Drupal 7, so not quite even where it is in Drupal 8, to do a very simple data load job that really could be handled in the feeds module. And it was massively overkill. And to that developer's credit, when I inherited the site, he looked at me and said, this thing is a beast and it's massively overcomplicated. You should take about an hour and a half and rebuild it in feeds. But he had used migrate because it was the tool they always used. And so it was what he was comfortable with, and it's what he did. And then they lived with it for 2 years and said, this is awful because it takes 2.5 hours to set up your data and run it. Whereas you could just push a button with feeds and be done. And some of that was mistakes they'd made, but some of that was picking the wrong tool for the wrong job. And so constantly thinking about, are you using the right tool for the right job? Do you make the data atomic? Smaller pieces of data are easier to track and manipulate and test. Do you divide the source data into its constituent parts? Can you process individual pieces of data easily and cleanly? Does your process allow you to examine individual data points during the migration? We get wrapped up often with our data being kind of these large, complex pieces of things, and we kind of often, developers will try to get from point A to point B kind of in one move. or the fewest number of moves, because they're a little overwhelmed by the amount of data and the complexity of it. And you start to kind of hope it works, and you stop examining what's in individual fields, or you don't examine what's in individual records and recognize that there's actually some more variations that you need to plan for. And it often helps if you pull your data all the way down into its constituent parts, that after you've extracted it from your source system, really explode that data as much as possible, either in another holding database or in flat files or some other data structure, not necessarily just system memory during processing, but land it somewhere in all of its constituent pieces so you can stop and examine it, and then pick it back up in your tool and continue the transformations process. Really break apart the three pieces of an ETL tool, right? You've got the extract, transform, and load. Really do those in 3 steps, even if your tool lets you string them all together. And you can usually rewire it to run all together, but build your job in those 3 phases and really explode out that data at the beginning, as it comes out, and in that beginning of that transformation. So you've really extracted it into all of its pieces, and that you're ready to really work with it in small elements. Is your work repeatable? You will need to do this more than once. Is your process designed so you can run it over and over without error? Can you easily erase test attempts and start over on a clean slate? Do you have the capacity to do all the practice runs you need to complete your project successfully and on schedule? Again, because it's a migration and people often feel like it's a one-off, right? I'm just going to do this once. So if I throw all the data in the system, then I'm there. And I don't want to have to think about the fact that maybe I need to do this 37 times, that I'm going to end up having to run a test and then wipe all the data out and revise and run another test. Or I'm going to do a validation with the client and they're going to come back and say, like, that's great, but you missed 80% of the data. And you're going to need to run it again. Or you've just got these 16 fields in the wrong places. You're going to have to refactor and go again. So making sure in your jobs and in your process, you've built out that erase and reload, whether that's re-snapshotting a Drupal database or running delete jobs, particularly if you can run it in segments so that you're not having to refresh an entire data structure, but only the parts you're interacting with, so that you can just say, oops, okay, I ran that job, hit the reset, let's go again, and know that you're working on fresh ground and you're not trying to figure out, is this a bug from my last run? Or is this a bug in my current run? But always be working from that clean slate and be able to compare and be able to iterate quickly. Does each stage run cleanly? Each piece of a data migration builds on another, so each must work. When your migration is broken into sensible steps that build upon one another? Have you checked each individual segment of your migration? Can you stop your process after each stage to validate the results? Again, as I was saying, kind of with the atomic data, your process also needs to be atomic. You need to not only have those 3 phases, but inside, particularly the transformation step of a migration, be able to say, I've done all of my nodes. Let me see what the structures look like. Before I load it into Drupal and take all the time to pump it through the Drupal API, did I do it right? Did I actually get the title field into the where I want it to be, so it's going to end up in the title field? Do I know, have I broken out my taxonomy terms so they're going to end up where I want them to be? Am I figuring out what my files are and I'm structuring appropriately for them? Pulling all of that apart and then again, dropping it to disk somewhere, whether it's in a database or in something else, so that you can look at it and say, yes, this stage worked. And as part of that repeatable process, okay, it failed. I totally screwed up building my nodes. All right, truncate the table, run it again with the fix. And being able to look at that and not trying to process your entire set of structures every time. Just look at each piece and does each piece work? Keep it divided, keep it separate. Can you process samples of your data set? When you have lots of data, you need to test small parts to be sure the process works. Do you know how to create and run small segments of your total input? Are your segments made up of complete and valid samples? Does your sample include all errors and edge cases your data set might throw at you in practice? particularly if you've got large interconnected data structures. It's really normal for people to say, well, it's hard to figure out what a valid record is because it might touch 16 tables. So I can't, and I'm just going to run the whole thing. And if your data set's super small, you can get away with that because your transformations are going to run pretty fast. If you're working on 10 million records, you gotta sample your data down, and you need to work out a process to say, I can get all of Will's record. So I know I've got all of Will and all of his constituent parts in my sample set so that I can run it, that one record all the way through. And then working out what all the records are you need to say, I've covered all my edge cases. And when you do a larger sample, oh, I broke on Aaron's record. Okay, let me grab Aaron's record, add him to the sample set, and run it again so that I know that my sample is covering my edge cases. Is your work measurable? To know you moved all the data, you must know how much data is going in and how much is coming out. Can you accurately predict your output data volume based on the input size? Do you have valid estimates of running time required for each stage based on the data volumes? Are the estimates of expected data size from a reliable source? One of the biggest challenges I run into, particularly when you're moving from one data system to a totally different platform that may have radically different structures, is that calculating whether or not you've actually realigned, right? If I'm starting with 200, so the migration I'm in the middle of, I'm starting with 200,000 input records out of, in one source, in the piece I'm working from. It's actually out of two sources, but I have 200,000 input records. I am merging it with another 150,000 records, and I need to break it into 70,000 and 130,000 while merging with a independent data set. Knowing what all those ratios are is really critical to being able to say, yeah, I think I'm on track. So the first time I ran that migration, one of my objects, I got 138. I knew I had a problem because 138 is a long way from 70,000. And I knew I should be close to 1-to-1. And because I knew that measure, I could immediately stop and be like, we got to figure this out because this is a problem. This isn't off by a hair. We're not off by one, we're off by a lot. I also have, for this project, a truly excellent data manager. She's just as sharp as anybody I've ever met on her data structures, and she knows exactly what should be there, which makes it really reliable to know we're going to have just a hair over 200,000 records. That 70,000 mark is going to move up to 75, maybe 80 into the one bucket with the remainder into the other. She's able to give us really good precision. I've worked on other projects where they showed up with twice the data set size that we were told to expect, which threw all of our estimates out the window. You have to be able to estimate these things. You have to be able to at least be knowing that you're close so that when you're drilling in, you know you're not just going to find a ton of errors. And if you don't know how to measure it, you don't know where you are. Is your work fixable? Migrated data often needs to be updated after all the jobs are run. Do you have a plan to fix your data errors if found post-migration? Does your plan include ensuring you have external IDs or other links to be able to update all your records of every type? Do you have you validated this plan to work with actual sample jobs? This was literally how I spent my day. Was we did this mock run, we did a test. I'm short 70,000 records in one table. I've got some other places where I've got fields that are misaligned, and now I'm going back and updating the data set, both because the client needs to see that we can actually deliver this data where we said we would, but also I need to know that my process works to do those updates because none of us is perfect. It's entirely possible that we will get all the way through to the end and somebody will have missed something critical. We do a lot of testing, we double check our work, our clients validate our work, but that doesn't make us perfect. And so we have to make sure the job is built to be resilient to those errors. And so part of what I'm in the middle of testing is that resiliency. Can I push fixes on top of the data I loaded the first time. Do my keys really work? And so far they are, but it is part of the process, is making sure that I can fix mistakes. Not only that I'm trying to pick them up ahead of time, but that I'll still be able to recover post-migration. Is your migration testable? All good processes are rigorously tested. Do you have an automated testing solution that validates your process? Can you tell if the data migrated accurately after each test run? Do your tests cover all positive and negative cases? Data migration testing, particularly automated testing, is not easy. Many of the large ETL tools either don't have it or have it built for like testing, generated Java classes, but it's not really rigorously built for actually testing end-to-end data structures. You usually have to come up with some other way to be able to validate and test your data. But the more you can automate it, the more you can have good, rigorous unit tests, the faster you can move and the more data you can move at a higher reliability. Again, often it's the code that is set up for unit testing, not the data. And it doesn't actually matter in this case whether your code works. What matters is whether data got in and out. And yes, in theory, unit testing gets you there, but that's a lovely theory. We all know that in practice, once you run 100 jobs back to back, particularly if you run them over 10 million records, you probably missed a couple of edge cases. Something got through, and you need to have that larger ability to test both ends of the system, not just each stage of the pipeline. Is your code reusable? Migrations feel like one-off in processes, but teams that migrate once will migrate again. Have you ensured that as much of your code as possible can be reused? Do you have a shared library of migration code that your team can access? When you write new functions, are you thinking about ways to make them usable on your next project? Anytime you're writing code for migration, it's because the library, the platform, the product you're standing on top of had a gap you needed to fill. Sometimes those are truly client specific. It is actually a specific data mapping that you'll never see again. Usually, some of that code is things like, in our case, we move a lot of random systems into Salesforce. So I need dates formatted for Salesforce. So we have a function that lets you take a string date, validate that it's a valid string, matches the expected format, and pumps it out in the format Salesforce wants. We have a shared library with a bunch of functions like that. The first time somebody wrote it, it's like, I'm just parsing dates, and it's in this specific format. So I'm just gonna, it's Java, so I'm just gonna parse it with this particular string to tell it the format, as opposed to saying, well, I also need to null check, and I need to blank check, and I'm going to Salesforce, and Salesforce thinks time started January 1st, 1700 and ends December 31st, 4000. So the date's got to be in that range. And we've kind of slowly iterated out, building out that whole thing, plus what's part of the library with all the other stuff that we just do all the time. And because we're targeting a specific platform, we know the formats it needs to have. And so we have shortcut functions so that we don't recreate the wheel every time. Yes, each migration is a one-off to some extent, but man, is there a lot of overlap, and wow, does that library save us time. Making sure you've got it, and that for a long time, one of our problems was our team didn't have access. The person who started it had access, but it didn't get widely shared. And so we had a couple versions start to crop up, or somebody would email. And now it properly lives in GitHub in a private repository, so each member of the team can grab it and share it and circulate it so we have it to go forward. Finally, did you know Attain Partners is hiring? Come work with me. Are you interested in working on large-scale projects with excellent nonprofits and higher education institutions? Do you like Java, Apex, and other strongly typed C-like languages? Can you learn new tools and platforms on demand? Have you thought about how much fun it would become work with me every day? We do need developers. I would love to have some more folks. I'd love to have references because I'm busy, and I'd love to have some folks to share the load with. So that being not the serious part of the migration, but a serious ask, if you know anybody interested. So it's a short talk tonight. That's what I had to get. Questions, thoughts, feedback?
And depends where you land. If PHP can be a strongly typed C-like language.
It is not a strongly typed C-like language.
Oh no, it's whatever the
You can
polar
do lots
opposite
of
of
type
that
hinting.
is. I think I've heard it referred to as PHP supports like Schrodinger's types.
I like that.
I will say, having gone from web development to Salesforce development, while Apex is a fairly different beast, Apex is Salesforce's internal language. Apex is a very different beast from PHP. It's Java-like. It's a Java derivative. The nature of being in a highly constrained environment where you must run in memory bounds, you must run in time, and you get other Salesforce imposes some other governors on you that were new to me when I came to Salesforce world, but being used to being in a governed world where you're like, you will finish this before PHP times out. And you will do it regardless of server conditions. And you will finish this within the PHP memory limit. Being used to that did make the transition way easier. Other folks who are used to kind of running just on desktop application kind of environments are like, what happened? Why did I run out of memory? Like, because you ran out of memory, doesn't care why. You're out. You must use less.
We can solve this problem by throwing more memory at it. It's the more I've started working with some other languages, the more my love-hate relationship with PHP grows, I guess is a fair way to say. I actually did have a couple of questions. One that jumped out, and you said it so casually that makes me think maybe I've missed something obvious for years. What's a data manager? Other than as the title kind of hints at someone that manages the data.
Often it's it really is almost that simple, but we use it as the title, and sometimes it is a formal title, but it's the person who's responsible for the database. Sometimes they are kind of certified administrators on a platform. Sometimes they are, hey, you know how to drive a mouse. Here's our most important data system. You're now responsible for it. But they're responsible less for actual data entry stuff and more it's the like, is the data clean? Can somebody run the big reports? When somebody creates dupes, are they running, who's responsible for the process of dealing with it? They're the person who knows your data set inside and out and is responsible on a day-to-day basis. And some of them are better than others. Like I said, right now I have a client.
Is that from like know the data set from a schema perspective or from a, I don't want to say content, but
it's more from the content perspective. It starts from the content perspective, because usually, like with us, it'll be the person that we know to ask the like, "Hey, Will, who's the most complicated person in the database?" Because we would like to test the crap out of their migration, and so we want to know who is the person who keeps you up at night because you've had to fix their record 97 times. They hit every edge case in your current tool. It's the person who knows that.
So it would, in a sense, be like a project owner, but like for the complexities of the data for the given project.
Yeah, I mean, depending on your organization size and structure, like it can be the product owner for the old platform or for the new platform, or it can be like their direct report because the product owner is getting to think at high levels and the person who's stuck dealing with making the product owner's stuff happen. Again, usually that expert running reports, and the role can shift. We use it somewhat as a generic title because it's different organizations define it very differently, and they may or may not have an actual title, but it's who is that person who you go to say, hey, how do I find this thing, this person, this set of information from this report? Who is that kind of key person? Like I said, and for us, it matters a lot how good they are right now. Like I'm just super fortunate because I've got an awesome person in that role in the biggest client I'm working with right now. She is just when she was out at the beginning of the project, and when she came back, she just put on this master class of sharp, fast decision making of like, we're trying to figure out the boundaries of what data we're moving. And her boss had been on the like, I don't know, we should just move all the data. We're like, great. So we need a list of literally every table and field. And she got back and she's like, all the data, that's crap. All of our data before 2018 is garbage. Like, I don't want to see anything from before 2018 ever again. Like, okay. She's like, and you need this report. This is the data we're moving. All right.
Yeah, love that direction.
And she, yeah. And she's also, and now we're at the point where like the fixes I'm doing, she's like, where is this field? Like, I need this value right there. And she's right. I mean, it's awesome.
Okay, so that may get at kind of the other, it might get into like answering that other question I had, which is more of how you handle validating the data that you pulled out of the source system during the extract phase before, like you're saying, like going through all the trouble to wire it into, this case, Drupal's APIs. What's the process for validating that, one, you've extracted the data correctly, but also two, that the data was extracted correctly, but that it maybe matches your assumptions of what would be there, or kind of reconciling the differences?
So there's a couple of things that I do and that our team does because it is those are critical issues and they're slightly different. So there's the issue of like, do I have the data set of the size, and did I get my queries right so that I extracted the right data? And that can be messy depending on, particularly if you don't have a super strong data manager on the other side, because they may not know how to write that query and run, or have a comparison report. So often systems like you have the reporting engine, and so you can at least run the reporting engine, get a count, and then run your query and does my count match?
So
if
that
I pulled the same data out,
kind of
even if
your
it's in very
process?
different structures, at least being able to count
Gotcha.
correctly. Particularly once the data set gets very large, you have to be mostly count driven, because it's not like you can check 2 million records by hand.
You cannot.
Humans suck at that. That's why we built these machines to process data for us. In terms of validating its structure, for me, I've become a real big proponent of that separation of like, you extract the data and you get that out, and you have a really fully independent transformation phase. And so even though I'm doing things in Talent, which is an ETL tool, and sometimes in Informatica and other things, I really like to extract from the source system and put into a holding database. So I will pull whatever data you give me and load it into MySQL into a matching schema. In part because that then gives me that breakpoint to say, you've changed the schema on me. You've added a field, you changed the values in this restricted list. Like, I used an enum on this, so I know as soon as I went to load the data that you added a value and you didn't tell me. Right. And it's not always that kind of competitive nature, although sometimes it is. You're trying to slip stuff through. And sometimes it's just like, oh, whoops. But now I know before I start my transformation, so like, so the data doesn't line up anymore. I need to stop and rerun my testing process and be able to make sure that I'm going to actually be able to process this data as opposed to not. Also, both extract and load sides on almost any platform. If you're not using a raw database like MySQL or Oracle or SQL Server, like if you're not literally talking at the database level, if you're in an API level, the speed difference is so massive in almost any system that I tend to want to have, like, I run all my transformations back into another database. And so if my target system isn't a database that I can just truncate and reload all the time, I'm going to want, again, a database that matches my target schema. I've actually written a tool for Salesforce that takes Salesforce and turns it into a SQL database at the schema level.
Nice.
So that I can actually just like, good, I've landed in a database that matches my production Salesforce org. And I can know again that I've got that I've gone through my transformation phase cleanly, and we can validate, and it allows us to write better validation tools that run dramatically faster than waiting for everything to pump up into Salesforce and then process. And again, almost any platform has that same, right? You're going into the Drupal API. If you're passing through the Drupal API, the only safe way to get into full data structures, get comfy. That is not a system meant for high-speed write.
Nope, no, it's not.
High-speed read, yes, but not high-speed write.
I've done this once. I think you've done this too. You can set up parallel writings at the same time. Okay. Yeah.
Within certain bounds.
You're the other person I know that's done that.
I did that up until I found the deadlocks in core.
That 7 or 8?
That was 8.
It's
It's an avoidable deadlock if you have MySQL or InnoDB settings access, which if you're saying Pantheon, you do not.
No, you do not.
But the deadlock is there's a field in the Bootstrap table that is there to set the most recent cache reset time, which is the write time of the most recent object. Not quite. It's more nuanced than that, but the most recently written cacheable content entity with a route or something. Like it's got a couple of conditionals on it. So if you write to that table too fast, it's a problem, and it gets read every time you load an object. So if you're doing anything that's loading data and writing at the same time, you'll deadlock on that field, and you can reset InnoDB to just write lock that field and not read lock it.
Interesting.
And so it'll be out of date. It'll be wrong. Like what it risks is you could be wrong. But
You can.
if you're say loading 600,000 users,
Oh,
it's okay to be wrong while that process is running about when your cache needed to be cleared, because you're probably flushing the cache at the end anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah. Yes, I have run to fully bottleneck most servers. You need to run, in my experience, multiple processes to fully consume all your resources up until you hit that deadlock.
Interesting.
And on Pantheon, then you're done.
Yeah, we for many reasons we had to migrate off of Pantheon. That was one. We had intentionally were migrating and writing to multiple tables to try to circumvent that. My last question was just, especially like I'm interested. I've only ever really, well, I guess it's not true. I worked with a couple Drupal systems that were scaled up to database tables that were in the millions of rows. Scaling beyond that, or just removing Drupal from the equation entirely, what are some of the scalability constraints that come in to like recognize and choosing the right tool, or are hurdles you'll know you're going to encounter at certain scales?
I mean, it's figuring out what that bottleneck performance issue is. So if you're right, so for when we target Drupal, often our write time is that final data load is our bottleneck. Waiting on the Drupal API, even if you've multi-threaded, you're still only writing so fast. And that's your bottleneck time. The other systems, frequently it's that middle, it's somewhere in that transformation phase, particularly again, as the data scale goes up, even if it's not truly bottlenecking, if it's like, I can run my like Talend, which we use a lot, it's essentially an Eclipse-based Java generator with a declarative UI. So you build in a visual interface, build out your data migration, and then it generates Java. And when you run it in its UI, it like stops and compiles the Java every time, and then runs the job, and then it loads up the next job and compiles the Java and runs it. and it's doing it inside of Eclipse with all of the overhead that comes with Eclipse. But it also allows you can actually export jobs as applications because it's Java. So you can actually then, you lose all your UI, but you pick up vast speed improvements because now you've got an actual binary running at least at vastly superior speeds. And then you start to be bottlenecked by your system capacity, not the overhead of Eclipse. And so if the data set is small, like for this one that's only 200,000 records, I can run it through with the UI just fine, just watch it. Yeah, it would be faster if I did, but not so much faster that it's worth the other issues and overhead of trying to be able to create the extra tooling to say, hey, it stopped right here, and this is what went wrong. Whereas the UI just does that. So it's figuring out, is that going to help you? Can I just throw more server at it, or have I hit the limits of what this solution will do? Informatica can be the same way. It's also similar, except for they compile a web-based similar kind of concept. It's a Java generator, but it runs much faster by default because it's web-based, so they're compiling it on save every time you save your job, and then kind of rips through. But that one's how much you paying. Is it on they throttle you by how much you paid them, and all of those then output at and how fast does my target system load. And it's not usually, we don't usually have too much problems with the extracts unless somebody's being super precise on their timing. Like now and then there's at 5 p.m. we're going to stop taking donations. So we can extract all this data from the system, transform it, and load it into Salesforce. And we'd like our donation system to be down for the smallest possible window.
I can see it being a problem.
And that can be a little intense and exciting. And finding tools that then do the extract really fast. And can we potentially bypass the API of the platform that we're coming out of, which sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. Just depends on is it running on top of a database that's exposed versus not. The other one I'm starting to experiment with, because I've seen some results that dropped my floor to the jaw on performance, was MuleSoft, which is now Salesforce owned, but is also platform agnostic. It's an ETL tool that Salesforce went out and bought. And I've seen some performance characteristics of that I don't believe yet, because they were so they have me so amazed. And they even claim they have a Drupal 8 connector. I have never seen this thing, but I have heard rumor of it, that they have a Drupal 8 connector that does not run through the API and writes properly to the database. Which leaves me so many questions about how you would pull that off. Like just writing the thing blows my mind, but would be amazing if that's true. And
feels like a lot of scary assumptions.
There are a lot of scary stuff. It's not a cheap tool. I mean,
sure.
it should, at the price you pay for it, it should perform like that. ETL tools are either open source and free, or they are very expensive, or they're like Talend, which is literally both. You can get the community version of Talend for free. You have to jump through some hoops, give them your name and address, but I mean, right, it's the contact form. Or you can pay $1,000 a month for the licensed version. And they are one of the cheaper tools on the market. Prices go up from there. ETL tools are not cheap. There is a reason why many of us in the Drupal community write our own Drupal migrations in Drupal Migrate and write it all in PHP. And I think that's the only way to do it, because none of us have looked at these tools and they're very expensive.
I've acknowledged other ways to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I've never explored the tools. I've just looked at other ways to kind of bypass Drupal migrate. Interesting.
And honestly, I mean, Drupal migrate has some real nice advantages to it and whatnot. And when you come down to it, that last load part, if you aren't going to use a tool that's got some connector that somehow magically manages to bypass the Drupal API, which still feels like magic to me, and I haven't run it, so I don't believe it exists till I see it. Like, even with everything I've kind of learned to do over time, I would still do the, like, get it all transformed and ready in my final Drupal structures, not in like the full Drupal database, but flatten the node table down, flatten the tables down to just be nice, simple, flat to my actual schema. And then only load that data through migrate, like do all my extracts and transforms elsewhere. And then just like Drupal migrate, here is a MySQL database, one-to-one mapping.
Yep.
Go to town. But use something like Talend, like Informatica to do that upstream, particularly for anything at volume.
What a neat problem space you're in.
It is now and then fun to sit there and like, how much data are you using? Because the 200,000 records for us is like, this is relatively nothing in terms of volume. You have to go through, the only trick is you have to go through almost like, the difference between 200,000 and 2 million usually is running time. And do we have to do something to drive efficiency of running time?
Interesting.
Because at 200,000, somebody's got a typo in just about every field. There is some weirdo record that didn't follow any of the rules. There's some date in the year 5. That's why I know really well the Salesforce dates right now is 2 weeks ago, I bumped into, what do you mean you won't, I'm halfway through my data set. What do you mean you won't load that one field? No, I'm pretty sure this person was not born in the year 5. There's probably a 2 missing on the front of this date. But it could have been a 199 missing on the front too, or, if there's any number of things that could have been that date. But it probably, what this person applying for college was probably not born in the year 5. 2005 seems a much more likely age. But
sure that does.
So now our library includes the validation for, apparently nobody had run into this for the date was otherwise valid, but
outside of the acceptable ranges.
So now we have a check to see if it's also in the valid range. And yeah, I mean, like the libraries become that kind of stuff. And I know, like when I did migrate stuff, I built out libraries that were similar of like, I just need, like I do this all the time here. Now I've got one to help me deal with getting from keywords to taxonomy terms. Because you do it 10,000 times, you might as well generalize it so you don't have to write it ever again. Also proprietary to an employer, so I will have to write it again if I ever do it again, but I know how. Yeah.
Those are all the questions I had. Appreciate it. I liked the presentation. I don't know if anybody else has any other questions or queries.
I'm open to also just presentation style feedback. This is literally the only time I've ever read a PowerPoint slides to people, because I usually hate that with a passion, but it felt right for the style of presentation. And you guys haven't told me that I nearly killed you with boredom, so.
I did have one question. I don't think it really pertains to, I don't know. So whenever you're migrating a site and you gave the example of, your data manager saying, we don't need data past a certain, date or before a certain date. So we can just remove all of that. I've worked on many projects before where, you archive a site, you just put it there, but what happens to that data? I mean, is it just literally gone forever? I mean, is it stored somewhere? Is it put on an archive somewhere? Like, you're posting it on a Pantheon sandbox, for example? I mean, granted, the sites you're working on, probably not, but there's a lot of ways you could do that and store that, and just use it as a historical reference, being able to kind of cross compare. And I guess it's 2-part questions. What's the practices that you deal with on that scale, and then I guess where do they go to where do they end up living? I mean, like I've seen so many before that we provided it to a client, they go away, and presumably it's still there. Is there a practice for? I mean, I know there's good practices to turn it off when you're not using it, maybe post it local, but
So I went back to this slide because for me, it's part of the fixable of, oh dear God, we don't throw it away.
Yeah.
Unless we have absolutely no choice. And actually the system I'm working with right now, there is some data that's non-extractable. Like they just have no way to get it back without literally having somebody sit there and copy and paste from the data system into something. That other than that situation, yeah, you archive it somewhere in format varies depending on source project. So right, like if I'm coming out of a website, I'm at the very least gonna, static shot that site somewhere.
Yeah.
Because they're gonna miss something.
Of course.
Right, there's gonna be something you want back. The more you can keep it in databases, obviously, the easier it's gonna be to do that future processing. But
right.
Yes, archiving it somewhere in some form so that you can rerun it or run updates to say, oh, you didn't tell us you wanted that other field off of every silly, stupid one of these things, like that image that we threw away because you said you didn't want it. Oh, now you want it. I guess we better go find all the references to it and figure out how to make that image file reattach to that node for your entire system. And nobody wants to do that by hand. So
Gotcha.
Yeah, you archive it. The trick does kick into, I mean, less important in web unless there's a portal where when you have a large collection of personal information, you also need to have people work out a data retention policy. It gets less important if you're just talking about public content, because data retention forever is usually okay, unless you're talking about a bank or other people with, why pay S3 pricing when you could go with Glacier?
Right. Yeah. So I mean, like I guess where would that line be drawn from where? I mean, I guess it depends on the project too, but
it's going to depend on the client and their willingness to pay. And right, if they're willing to pay for S3, then great, drop it all in S3 and leave it there. If they are never really going to touch it, go to Glacier and pay even less.
Like, do you have like any type of like database or like any? I mean, do you just say the database? Or are you trying to build relationships anyway? Or are you just grabbing a site and trying to archive it? And again,
I mean, if there's a data, if we're pulling from a data source with a database, then I'm going to mirror that database. And whether it's like that, and that for me, it's part of that extract into a snapshotting database. Like I can extract all your data. Like even if I'm only loading into the new system data, past whatever cutoff or whatever parameters, I've got a database structured to hold all the data you might want. So let's just put it all there. And then we can preserve that in some appropriate way. When we're talking about a website, it's more likely to be I'm snapshotting to static, unless you're really coming out of a well-structured system. Like if you're coming out of a well-structured CMS, then sure, I'll preserve the structures of the CMS. If you're coming out of WordPress and it's just giant piles of HTML that I had to parse to get you into your new well-structured Drupal site, I'm just going to static snapshot the thing. Like I'm going to pull out HTTrack or some other website snapshotting tool and drop it all to a disk and send it out to S3, Glacier, whatever. Whatever you want to, or you've got Azure drives, or I don't care. I'm going to put it on a drive somewhere. And the updatable and fixable part might be a little more challenging because I'm no longer pulling from kind of the WordPress database and how I'm pulling from static HTML files that I have to parse differently. But at least I still have all the data. And honestly, that stuff kicks in more when you're talking about like I'm moving your product catalog, where you might have 100,000 products, right? Where it is more data and less content. When things are mostly content, the structures aren't really all there to preserve. And so you're not necessarily, the updates are less worrisome. It's more like, oops, did I break all your images? Let me go rewrite all the image paths to be correct. It's not going to be like, well, yeah, you guys didn't actually put the price in the div. You said you put the price in on every stupid page. You put the price in 19 different divs, and we only got 15 of them. Well, yeah, at this point, we might be at, let's get all the ones that have a price 0 and send somebody out to go find the price on the source page, or, like, depending on our scales and whatnot. But when we're looking at something like a product catalog where you're going to have just thousands of products potentially, each with actual data associated with them, now you're more into like, let me save that somewhere. let me put that in, leave that in a database that I can work with in the future. And even that, like, again, then when I'm done, export that database to a SQL file, MySQL dump the file out and put that somewhere, because I might want it back. You might call in 6 months and saying, hey, we forgot to ask for the second SKU, or the legacy SKUs. We want the legacy SKUs from the 3 systems ago back. And I might be rolling my eyes and wondering why you want it, but I better be able to get it.
Yeah.
Because a lot of our stuff is constituent kind of data and people data, and then you also then kick into that data retention. You don't necessarily want to retain all those data points forever, because people don't necessarily want you to remember them forever, particularly if they're, say, European or Californian, and they have data privacy rules that you have to abide by. Getting rid of their data so you have fewer people to worry about and less data to provide them makes your life better.
Yeah, that's all the questions I had. That was great. Thanks, Aaron.
Stopping the recording.
Sure.